Running late that morning would change Juliet Collins' life forever, but not in the way anyone could have expected. Her heels clicked rapidly against the sidewalk as she hurried toward the subway station, clutching her laptop bag. The promotion meeting was in 20 minutes, and after 5 years of dedication at Morton & Associates, this was her moment to finally move up from junior analyst. That's when she saw him. A well-dressed older man collapsed on the ground, his briefcase spilled open beside him. While others hurried past, some even stepping over him, Juliet's heart stopped. Without hesitation, she dropped to her knees beside him, her black pencil skirt gathering dirt from the sidewalk. "Sir, can you hear me?" Her fingers trembled as she checked for a pulse. It was there, but weak and irregular. She immediately dialed 911, her other hand holding his clammy wrist. "Please hurry, I think he's having a heart attack," she pleaded with the dispatcher, her voice cracking. The minutes waiting for the ambulance felt like hours. Juliet kept talking to the unconscious man, hoping her voice might anchor him to life. "Stay with me, sir. Help is coming. You're going to be okay." She noticed a gold wedding band on his finger and found herself wondering about his family, praying they wouldn't lose him today. When the paramedics arrived, they confirmed her fears. It was indeed a heart attack. "You probably saved his life by acting so quickly," one of them told her. Without thinking twice, Juliet climbed into the ambulance with them. She couldn't bear the thought of him being alone. Her phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from her supervisor about the missed meeting, but she silenced it. Some things were more important than promotions. In the emergency room, she provided what little information she could to the nurses and waited until they stabilized him. 2 hours later, Juliet finally arrived at work, her makeup smudged and her clothes wrinkled. She'd missed the promotion meeting entirely. Mr. Peterson, her notoriously strict boss, was waiting by her desk, his face set in stone. "Ms. Collins, my office." "Now." His words cut through the tense silence of the open office space. Her colleagues avoided eye contact as she walked past them, head held high despite knowing what was coming. "You missed the most important meeting of the quarter," Mr. Peterson began, his voice eerily calm. "A meeting where our biggest client was present. A meeting where you were supposed to present the quarterly analysis you prepared." "Sir, I can explain. There was an emergency, Daft. I don't care if the sky was falling, Ms. Collins. This company doesn't run on excuses. Do you know what happened in that meeting? Your colleague Thomas had to present your work unprepared. He fumbled through it, made us look incompetent, and now the client is reconsidering their contract with us." Juliet's throat tightened. "I saved someone's life this morning," she whispered. "And now I'm ending your career." Mr. Peterson slid a termination letter across his desk. "Pack your things. Security will escort you out." As Juliet cleaned out her desk, fighting back tears, her phone lit up with a notification. The hospital calling about the emergency contact information she'd left. The man she'd saved was in critical condition but stable. They couldn't reach his family yet and asked if she'd come back to help with some paperwork. Standing in the lobby with her box of belongings, Juliet looked at her phone, then at the security guard waiting to escort her out. 5 years of climbing the corporate ladder, gone in an instant. She should have been devastated, angry, desperate about losing her job. Instead, she felt an inexplicable pull back toward the hospital. "You know what?" she said to no one in particular, straightening her shoulders. "I made the right choice." She hailed a taxi, leaving behind the gleaming office tower that had been her second home. But she had no idea that this moment, this terrible career-ending moment, was actually the beginning of something far bigger than she could imagine. The next few weeks tested every ounce of Juliet's resilience. Her savings dwindled rapidly as rejection emails flooded her inbox. Each morning, she'd apply for jobs until her eyes burned from staring at the screen, but her sudden dismissal from Morton and Associates cast a long shadow over her resume. The whispers in the industry about her unreliability had spread faster than she could defend herself. But every afternoon, without fail, she'd make her way to the hospital. Room 412 became her sanctuary, where the steady beep of heart monitors replaced the familiar buzz of office phones. The mysterious man, whose name she learned was Daniel Richardson, lay there, still unconscious but fighting. The nurses had grown used to her presence, sometimes leaving a chair pulled up close to his bed. "I had another rejection today," Juliet would tell him, arranging fresh flowers she'd bought despite her shrinking budget. "But you know what's funny? I don't regret helping you. Not for a second." She'd talk to him for hours, her voice soft but steady in the sterile hospital room. Sometimes about her job search, sometimes about her fears, and occasionally about her childhood dreams that seemed further away with each passing day. One particularly rough afternoon, after a promising interview had ended with a familiar, "We'll keep your resume on file," Juliet broke down in room 412. "I don't know how much longer I can hold on," she confessed to Daniel's silent form. "My landlord's been patient, but I'm 2 months behind on rent now. I might have to move back home next week." Her voice cracked. "I built a life here, you know? 5 years of early mornings, late nights, missed holidays. All gone because I stopped to help someone in need." The nurses would sometimes find her asleep in the chair, her hand resting near his, job applications scattered across her lap. They never had the heart to wake her until visiting hours ended. One of them, Rose, would often bring her coffee and share stories about patients who had beaten the odds. "Talk to him about anything," Rose encouraged her one evening. "Coma patients can sometimes hear more than we realize." So Juliet did. She told him about her small hometown, about leaving it behind with big dreams of making it in the city, about her younger sister's upcoming wedding that she might not be able to attend now, about the stack of unpaid bills growing on her kitchen counter. As her situation grew more desperate, Juliet started selling her belongings. First, her designer work clothes. She wouldn't need them anymore. Then her grandmother's antique bracelet, which hurt more than she'd expected. Her apartment slowly emptied, each missing piece a reminder of her fading city dreams. "I have to leave next week," she told Daniel one rainy afternoon, her voice heavy with defeat. "My sister bought me a bus ticket home. Can't say I'm not grateful, but..." She wiped away a tear. "It feels like giving up, you know? I always thought if you worked hard enough, did the right things, life would somehow work out." Pretty naive, right? That evening, as she packed the last of her belongings into worn cardboard boxes, Juliet's phone rang. It was Rose from the hospital. "There's been a change in Mr. Richardson's condition," she said, her voice urgent. "You should come." Juliet's heart raced as she rushed to the hospital one last time, not knowing if the news was good or bad. The elevator ride to the 4th floor felt eternal. As she approached room 412, she noticed unusual activity. Nurses moving quickly, voices speaking in excited tones rather than their usual hushed whispers. She paused at the doorway, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the handle. Whatever waited on the other side, she knew this would be goodbye, to Daniel, to her life in the city, to everything she'd worked for. But she had no idea that opening that door would change everything, and that sometimes life's biggest blessings come disguised as our worst moments. When Juliet opened the door, the sight before her made her gasp. Daniel Richardson was sitting up in bed, his eyes open and alert, looking directly at her. The machines that had been her constant companions during their one-sided conversations were silent. In their place was the sound of his voice, deep, warm, and somehow familiar, though she'd never heard it before. "So you're the guardian angel who's been keeping me company," he said, a gentle smile playing across his face. The nurses quietly slipped out of the room, leaving them alone. Juliet stood frozen, tears welling in her eyes. You can hear me?" "I heard everything," Daniel replied, his voice growing softer. "Every word, every story, every tear. I heard about your job, your struggles, your sister's wedding." He paused, his expression growing serious. "And I heard about Peterson firing you." Confusion crossed Juliet's face. "How do you know Mr. Peterson's name?" "I never mentioned Dath." "Because, Miss Collins," Daniel straightened in his bed, suddenly looking more commanding despite his hospital gown, "Morton and Associates is my company. I'm Daniel Richardson, CEO and majority owner. Though I prefer to keep that quiet. Helps me see how the company really runs when I visit different branches." The room seemed to spin around Juliet. She gripped the doorframe for support, her knees weak. "Your company. But then I know exactly how Peterson treats his team. I've heard similar stories from others, but I was never able to catch him in the act." Daniel's eyes hardened. "Until now. Until he fired someone for saving my life." Juliet sank into her familiar chair, her mind racing. "The morning I found you, you were on your way to inspect the branch office, weren't you?" Daniel nodded. "Annual surprise audit. Peterson never knew I was coming. Instead, he spent that morning terrorizing his best analyst for showing basic human decency." He reached for a folder on his bedside table. "Speaking of which," inside the folder was a contract. Juliet's hands trembled as she read it. An offer for the position of Regional Director of Operations, with a salary that made her eyes widen and benefits that included immediate health coverage and housing allowance. "But I'm just a junior analyst," she whispered. "No," Daniel corrected her. "You're someone who stopped to help a stranger when everyone else walked by. Who visited that stranger every day for weeks, even as your own life was falling apart. Who showed more integrity and leadership in one morning than Peterson has shown in his entire career." Tears rolled down Juliet's cheeks as Daniel continued. "The apartment across from mine in the Richardson building is vacant. It's yours if you want it. Consider it back pay for all those afternoons you spent keeping a lonely old man company." "I don't know what to say," Juliet managed, still staring at the contract. "Say yes," Daniel smiled. "Because tomorrow morning, Peterson is getting his long overdue termination notice, and I need someone I trust to help reshape that toxic culture he created." Just then, Rose peeked her head in. "Mr. Richardson, the doctor needs to do some final checks." "Of course," he nodded, then turned back to Juliet. "Think about it overnight. Though," he added with a knowing smile, "from what I've heard of your story, you're not someone who backs down from a challenge." As Juliet walked out of the hospital that evening, she held the contract close to her chest. The city lights seemed brighter somehow, the evening air sweeter. Her phone buzzed, a text from her sister about the bus ticket home for tomorrow. Looking up at the skyline, Juliet smiled and began typing a response. She wasn't going anywhere. In fact, she was just getting started. The transformation at Morton and Associates was swift and dramatic. Word spread quickly about Peterson's dismissal and Juliet's unexpected promotion. Some whispered about favoritism, but those whispers died down as they watched her work. She arrived early each morning, bringing the same dedication she'd shown during those hospital visits to rebuilding the company's culture. Daniel kept his word about mentoring her. Their weekly strategy meetings often ran long, not because of business discussions, but because they kept finding themselves sharing stories and laughing about nothing in particular. He taught her the intricacies of running a major corporation, while she showed him how to connect with the younger employees who had been too afraid to approach him before. The office atmosphere transformed under their joint leadership. Gone were the days of fear and cutthroat competition. Juliet implemented flexible hours and emergency leave policies, remembering all too well how a single morning could change someone's life. She made it her mission to know every employee's name, just as the nurses had known hers during those long afternoons in room 412. During one late evening at the office, Daniel found her still at her desk, reviewing employee satisfaction surveys. "You know," he said, leaning against her doorframe, "most regional directors don't stay until 9 p.m. reading comment cards. Most regional directors didn't get their position by talking to their boss while he was in a coma," she replied with a smile, then noticed his expression. "What's wrong?" "Have dinner with me," he said suddenly. "Not as your mentor, not as your boss. Just dinner." The professional wall they'd carefully maintained for months cracked slightly. "That would be complicated," Juliet responded, her heart racing. "Life is complicated." Daniel stepped into her office. "Sometimes you're running late to work and end up saving someone's life. Sometimes you lose everything and gain something better. Sometimes—" He paused, moving closer to her desk. "Sometimes you fall in love with someone's voice before you ever open your eyes." 2 weeks later, they had their first date, not at some fancy restaurant, but in room 412, which they'd rented for the evening. Rose helped them smuggle in takeout and set up battery-operated candles. They sat in the same chairs where Juliet had spent so many afternoons, but this time, both of them were wide awake and talking. "I kept wondering," Daniel admitted, "during those weeks in the coma, if you'd still visit each day. But you never missed a single afternoon." "I needed those visits as much as you did," Juliet confessed. "Talking to you. It gave me hope when I had none left." Their relationship grew naturally, built on months of one-sided conversations that had somehow laid the foundation for something real. The board members raised eyebrows when they began dating officially, but no one could deny that the company was thriving under their shared vision. 1 year to the day after Juliet had found Daniel on that sidewalk, he proposed. Not with a grand gesture, but with a simple question asked in the hospital parking lot where she'd once watched an ambulance drive away with a stranger who would become her future. "Remember what you told me when you thought I couldn't hear you?" he asked, holding both her hands in his. "About believing that if you worked hard and did the right things, life would work out?" She nodded, tears forming in her eyes as she realized what was happening. "You weren't naive," he continued, dropping to one knee. "You were right." The ring he offered wasn't just a symbol of their love. It was a reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually doorways to something extraordinary. That morning when Juliet ran late for work hadn't ruined her life after all. It had led her exactly where she needed to be. "Yes," she whispered, pulling him to his feet and into her arms. Behind them, Rose watched from a hospital entrance, smiling at the couple who had found love in the most unexpected place. A sterile room on the 4th floor, where a woman's kindness had touched a man's heart, even while it wasn't beating quite right. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.